Just to get a recap before we go into our thought questions, can someone read John chapter 2, verse 24 and 25?
But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man.
There's some things that God just don't waste his time with when it comes down to humanity and human beings. And if you know anything about God as a student of the Bible, I think you have come to the conclusion that God is extremely serious about his work. The harvest is what?
Plentiful.
And the labors are what?
Few.
What does the scripture say after that?
Pray that God will send
Someone
laborers into the harvest.
into the harvest. God is very serious about his work. God just don't send anybody to do his work. And those who don't want to do his work, those who don't want to be bothered with him, those who just want to mediocre their relationship with God, God is not serious with those people being spokesmen for him. So just understand that and know that when you're ready, God is ready. When it's not your season, it's not your season. But when you're ready, God is ready, because God don't have a whole bunch of people knocking at his gospel door and wanting to do his work. People who get involved with Christianity know just how tough it is as they go along in it. And a lot of people do the peril of the sword. They just give up. Satan knows it, and Satan does it. Another thing I would just like to throw out there too is Satan tries to beat God to God's business so he can destroy it. So know that. Satan has been around longer than any of us have. And he sees the progress of God. So any one of us that prays to God and we want to do things and we don't want to advance God's kingdom, Satan will throw so many monkey wrenches at us that it's not funny, because he knows how successful God is when it comes down to saving of souls, and that's not what he wants. So just think about that. Know that Jesus knew the hearts and minds of people, and take advantage of Jesus' personality, demeanor, and his mindset toward God's work. There were times when Jesus sat around and watched other people put money in stuff. Went to a party, went to a wedding, went to dinner, where he just acted like Jesus until it got spiritual. When it got spiritual, Jesus became the Son of God. And he can see right through people. It's just amazing to know that in his earthly ministry, he had that ability and the discernment to know who was going to do what and who wasn't. Okay, first question. Why did Jesus drive the animals out of the temple grounds and overturn the tables of the money changers? Did John say anything about animals?
Yeah. Yes, so in John, it spoke about Jesus driving out everything. So the sheep, the cattle, the money changers, the coins, everything. Because he was so angry with what they were doing in his house.
What does Matthew say about this account? Some of y'all should have a parallel Bible. Where you can go to the parallel passages. What does Matthew say? Anybody find it yet? It's not in chapter 2 of Matthew.
Chapter 21. It said Jesus entered Matthew 21:12.
Matthew what?
21:12.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, house will be called the house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple and he healed them. When you stop there?
Yep, stop there. Did you go do some studying this week about currency in the temple? You couldn't bring foreign currency in the temple with an image on it. So they had to go to an exchange, a currency exchange, to bring money into the temple. Okay, if you go back and you look at the law, you will see that. Okay, so that's why it was so popular, and money changers and vendors were all around the temple doing their 3 famous holidays that people were buying and selling. Okay, what were the restrictions on animals coming into the temple? Could you just bring any kind of animal in the temple? What were the restrictions on animals? They had to be what?
It's got to be the best of the best.
So you had to bring the best in. Now, when you start talking about sacrifice, using animals as a sacrifice, when you study this in totality, the Pharisees were selling the meat, selling the animals to local merchants because it was the best. They were making money on people coming in the front door and going out the back door. They was making money. Okay, and then you had that big debate over meats offered to sacrifice. So you start looking at how society functioned in the days of Jesus and the days after Jesus, and the times where religious people were doing certain things. You can see how Jesus got irritated just going up to the temple. He got irritated. Jesus was already had it up to here when he got to the temple. When he got to the temple, it was very noisy. It wasn't quiet. So something was going on. It was just like when Moses came back down from Mount Sinai with the tablets. Before they even seen the Israelites, they heard the Israelites. So imagine going up outside of the church itself. You got all these flea market things going on. People are crowded, people are buying, people are noisy, people are selling, and all those kinds of things. And then think about what it should be like to worship and what it had turned into on 3 of the greatest days for the Jewish calendar. Erica?
Remember that book that you showed us and it had the outer, the inner, and the inner? Where was this in the midst of the temple? Was this like the first layer, or was it the?
And that's a good question, because when you look at the illustration of that in the Bible chart, look at how they distorted that.
Because and when it's saying the rest of it is saying, and the children crying out in the temple and saying Hosanna to the Son of David. So I just
Let me show.
The Matthew account is not the same account. The Matthew account is the infant. This is when Jesus is about to die, right? The John account is very early. That was what last week Brother David Fritzinger read, talking about the Gentile in that illustration.
The Matthew account is before his death, the week before his death. John's account is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Do y'all know that?
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of like, I remember before when you had explained that image and you were saying like people had access to certain parts. So obviously like priests had access to that inner, but I'm just curious as to where this driving people and animals out was location wise.
To what Ellis said, Matthew account is towards the end of his ministry, and the John account is at the early. So that this happened twice.
Yeah,
Some scholars say it happened twice.
because the John account is at the beginning. Jesus went to Jerusalem multiple times in the 3.5 years, just from unaccounted for, just in terms of the holidays, but also accounted for in scripture. And then this part in John this is the part that Brother David read last week. In one of these areas of the temple, there's a section where only the Gentiles can go. That's where they were doing the exchanging, because I would come in. Remember, at this point, there's a huge intermarried portion of Jewish people at this time, right? So those people were looked down on. If you were biracial, you were looked down on. If you were biracial to the point where you were Samaritan, you were a dog. So like you could only go in so far, and therefore your currency, you coming from a whole nother country or area, you had to exchange that currency in the Gentile area before you even could get to the other. So the Pharisees had a good hustle because you needed to change your money and you didn't have a good sacrifice. So you had to spend money twice.
See, these are your court sections here. Okay, this is what the temple looked like in Jesus' day. Here's the triumphal entry. Okay, so remember what I was saying about the perimeter. See how all this is boxed off? Now, when you come inside, remember, none of y'all going in here. None of us is going in here. Okay? But then you have an inner court that was broken off for specific things. This had become the money changing section here. You had the court for women right here, there. You had the Nazareth vow, the court here for the Nazareth vow that they took. So when you got inside the temple had courtyard. See, and then you had the Gentile court. Yes, all those things were in. So it was God's will that all come to him. But remember, 400 years of silence produced something entirely different. So again, I say this all. Take a deep breath and just put yourself in Jesus's day, and then think of a flea market. Think of a rubbish sale, or I've been to many Catholic festivals, Greek festivals that was held on the Catholic Church property, and how things are roped off. And just think about Jesus coming up to this and seeing all this going on. It's just not what it was supposed to be. And see, when you look back at the grandeur of it all, this is Herod's temple. See, and this is Jerusalem. See, the Roman government was extremely smart. Roman government came and said, let's not take this out. You know, let's leave them with their religion and leave them with their glory. We just take them. And they got that concept from being some of the smartest political people on the planet. And they did a very good job of making people think, well, they ruled with a hard hand, but making people think, hey, just put into this tax system that we got going here. Don't riot, don't rebel, and y'all can have y'all God. We fine. Because we like to conquer. And we like to take over things. Okay? I mean, and then you get the Ark of the Covenant. You foolishly lost this in battle. But these articles of worship was inside the Holy of Holies. And this here, that veil that when Jesus ascended or came out of the grave itself, that veil was ripped in half. That part right there that exposed the innermost inner parts of the temple, meaning that wall of division right there that you see was now broken down. See, there was no need for that anymore because who is our high priest now? Jesus. So that system was done away with. And then in 70 AD, around 70 AD, this all was destroyed by the Roman government. They didn't leave not one of these stones upon, and the Bible said that in prophecy. So see, so in order for the system not to be reenacted, God had to get rid of it. Because human beings have a tendency to go back to what they were used to when it comes down to religion. But it is what it is. Nadine?
So it makes sense that there would be a place to change money somewhere and that there would be a place to sell animals because these Jews were coming from all over and it would not be feasible for them to be traveling with their animals from long distances. So it made sense for the Jews to say, hey, we can provide a service here. What doesn't make sense is where they were doing it. And on top of that, the surcharge that they had. You know, in the Matthew account, yes, it was towards the end of Jesus' ministry. But what he says there is a little bit different. You know, this time he said, you're making my place, God's place, a place of merchandise, buying and selling. And they were being disrespectful to God in that way. But in the Matthew account, he said, you're making this a den of thieves. That's what they were also doing because if it costs maybe 20 cents, they would maybe put it up to 40 cents. They were putting such a high surcharge on people buying animals that they needed and changing the money that they needed to do. You know, sometimes, even today, we take something that is convenient and we totally twist it that it's not acceptable, God. Because yes, it was a good service, but they just shouldn't have done it where they did it. Today, there are things that we can do that's good service, but we have to be mindful and respectful of God in the doing of whatever it is.
You remember the story of Jericho, the Good Samaritan, right? One of the priests that didn't do anything for the wounded guy said what? I can't do it. Why? Because there were some restrictions on priests. They couldn't touch anything that was dead or defiled, right? So I can't do it. I can't help this guy. Those who were in rotation for priests' duties here in Herod's temple there, they took care of the animals in that section. See, so you go from this to Jesus's day, you get everything out of order. See, Jesus already seen this before Abraham was, I am. So imagine God coming down as God taking a physical look at mankind and seeing how mankind had got so depraved in its worship to him that they created their own system. See, all this was done in order. Now, these are the non-blemished animals that are going to eventually end up on the altar. See? And it was blood everywhere. It was constant blood. Okay? And then these animals were sacrificed for sin. These were perfect animals. So when you get down to the nitty gritty and someone say, hey, wait a minute, light bulb just went on. Let's make some money. And the Roman government said, let's make more money. We're going to tax. So there's a temple tax. Because Rome found out that they had money to take care of this. So Rome said, let's impose another tax on them. Just like Hartford says, they're going to tax us for fishing license, property taxes on boats, motorcycles, on and on and on and on. Okay? They look around and say, this is a financial opportunity we're going to make. Jesus comes on the scene. And remember, in his 3.5 years, he's going to see these holidays. He's Jewish, so he's going to go up to the temple. And when he get up to the temple, he sees something entirely different. As God, How does that make him feel? Okay, well, we see how that made him feel. He erupted. He didn't hit nobody with the whip, but he did go off. Okay, now we see the nature of God when God gets upset. God does get upset. And he just took everything and just threw it on the ground and told him to get out. Pharisees looked and said, who do you think you are? Because the system that they set up did make a lot of money. And right now, that's all they're thinking about. They're thinking about a lot of money, Dad.
When we were there in Kathmandu's Valley, when I took you, I didn't take you guys there where this thing happening there in temple surrounding, especially those people not letting us in, Christian, Jews, and Muslim not letting in, but the Buddhist and the Hindu can go into the temple, and they have same setup, the same system. So there's we call parishar. It is the temple owns this area. The temple owns that area. Whatever they do by the temple's authority, only they allowed to do this, and they have to pay for them to set up the table. That table, what they are selling, the doves and cattle, whatever they were doing their business, they have to take money to their council, whoever letting them do this business, right? If we go all the way back Genesis, what they produce, they bring saying your produce. Like if you have a cattle or if you have an animal, then you sacrifice it. If you have a grain or whatever it is, you bring same thing, right? But this time we can see this because of long way that just like Sister Nadine said, because they came all the way. They're not gonna bring those animals and goats to walking by. So they came there, but their money was different country. They had to exchange first money and to buy the dog or anything or gold or that's how they extend their business. So here's the point: anything they do, they came to worship God, and that's very near by the temple because of just buy here and go worship there. And likewise, they enter inside because of the business. More closer, more you have more business. That's why in the temple in Kathmandu, same way. If you go into the temple, you have to pay more to the priest or the council of this temple because of that's how business run. And these people there was outside too, but mostly the Jesus throughout those tables and those they were inside of the temple, not outside of the temple. That's why he said my house, my father's house.
And he had every right to be upset. I mean, do you let somebody come in your house and do what they want to do? No, right? I don't care who it is. It could be, your best friend. If they start acting crazy and trashing up your place and defying your place, you're going to say something. You're going to say, whoa, wait a minute. Are you all right? Have you lost your mind? Can you imagine somebody coming in, let's say at Harvest Day, and just totally doing something entirely different than what we do on Harvest Day, and just start setting up their own stuff and being totally disrespectful to our home if they get that far. You know what I'm saying? You don't let it be done in your house. How do you think? And again, brothers and sisters, remember who is standing there. Jesus is standing there as God. Jesus sees things being unraveled spiritually. He can't take that. He can't let it go on. He just can't let people do what they want to do in God's house. We are under restrictions too. We just can't do what we want to do when we come in. That's why we have what? An orderly worship commanded by God. We can't come in here on Sunday and do what we want to do and that please God. We be vain worshiping, but it doesn't please God. So yes, Jesus had every right to get irritated, get mad, and do something about it. And that's what the rest of the questions are asking. Was he making a statement by doing this? Of course he was. What statement do you think he was making? Y'all need to stop this. I think that was clear. Y'all need to stop this because this is not right. Did they care about that? What did they care more about? Making money. And if I can trick you religiously into giving me money, just think about it. If you gave me, if 1,000 people gave me a $1 per person, what will I have? If 1,000,000 people gave me $1, what would I have? Don't you know people do that every day on TV? It's about numbers, and when they have these big crusades, people pay. People pay. What? I think it was 5 years ago. Benny Hinn was at the Giant Stadium, and the tickets was $42. You know how many people the Giant Stadium housed? He was healing people inside the stadium on the stage, but the ticket price was $42 per person. I can trick y'all into healing somebody if y'all give me $42 per person with 50,000, 75,000 people paying. And he was on a tour. He was on a tour. He toured. He had a summer tour that he did. Again, people pay for blessings all the time. It's nothing new. Handkerchiefs, water, oil. People pay all the time for blessings because they want to be that close to God because they think the person on TV is holy. They do.
So I do think Jesus was making a statement, and I think the statement that he was making is that he had the authority to do this. So normally the temple would be the domain of the priest, the high priest. They should have been doing this, but they didn't do it. So Jesus came as the Son of God, and he cleared them out. He threw them, overturned the tables to make the statement that he had that authority. And there was nobody else, no other Pharisee, no scribe, no Sadducee, nobody else could have done this because they didn't have the authority, but he did. And I think that's what he was making the statement here, that he had that authority.
The Pharisees, in conjunction to what you're saying, the Pharisees gave the authority for what to happen. Nobody else gave that authority. Nobody else had the authority to let people start selling in the temple. Caiaphas himself had to say yes to this. Jesus comes in and he turns the place upside down. And you know what the priest said? Who gave you the right to do that? Who gave you permission to do that? Under whose authority are you doing this? Remember, the temple had soldiers, right? Soldiers see you tearing up the place. They want to say, wait a minute. That's what we're here for. That's the temple. What authority are you? They ask Jesus that all the time. By whose authority are you saying this or doing that? Because the last time I checked, it was all right for us to come in here. Remember, my table getting turned over. I had to get permission to have a table. So who gave you permission to turn my table over? Because I already paid to have this table. That's why they clashed. That's why they asked him that. Who gave you the authority to do that? Because the last time, see, it's so common that we miss it. The last time I checked, it was all right for us to do that here. Donna?
Yeah, so Jesus's authority came from himself, right? He is the deity. So he part of the deity. So the authority was already in him, right? As Jesus often said, I just tell him I am. So the Lord saying I am. Jesus, when he says, you've made my Father's house, that declaration was already said. That meant to them that, listen, this is my Father's house, so I have the authority. I and the Father are one. He has often said that throughout the scripture. So it's like no different. If someone comes to my home and my children are there, they have the authority and the right to say to whomever that this can't happen or this can't happen. Jesus exhibited all authority, which was interesting because the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Jews, the high priests, all of them, none of them could understand what he was saying, right? That actually infuriated them for Jesus to say it's his Father's house, because from there he went on to say that he was going to destroy the temple, and then they just went beside themselves. But the authority was already within him. And that was a declaration for him to proclaim, this is my Father's house. I am the Son of God. I'm God in the flesh. And I don't think they understood that. And I could see why they wouldn't. But even the people that were coming to buy this stuff, when you look at they're like the whitewashed tombs, right? So here they are, as Jesus called the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the past whitewashed tombs. They presented, I'm sure, selling stuff like they were doing a good deed. I'm selling you these animals because you didn't bring them with you, and I need to exchange your coins because the coins can't come in. And the people would have looked at that as wow, this is really nice. We don't have to carry anything with us when we get there. We're going to be able to buy what we need to go into the temple. But they were just really making money off the people, and the people couldn't see that. So they gave an appearance, I'm sure, of righteousness, but they were far from that.
Exactly right. Next question says, do you find it uncharacteristic of Jesus that he made a whip and drove the animals from the temple? What do you think? You think he's the Son of Man and he's the Son of God? He is where he should be in the temple. How many of y'all got hit with a belt, but you were told not to do something? Now, this brother put up. When you are losing control, we all have been there. When you say something over and over and over again, or when you feel that you have to make a point, your volume goes up, correct? You get all this air in your lungs and it's getting ready to come out. Sometimes you use some choice words. Sometimes your words are under control, but you do not talk like a wimp when you're trying to stress a point, especially when you irritate. If I take a rope and braid it together where the end of it, when I pull it back, snap, the animal is going to hear that and they're going to move. See, I don't have to make animals move when I start doing things uncharacteristic of their surroundings. I just have to startle them with the noise. And if anybody ever got hit with a whip, they know what that's going to feel like if it connects. Now, Jesus did something under control that you and I wouldn't have done. We wouldn't connect. Jesus didn't, because he can't sin. See, he had it under control. But he put that whip in that temple, and everybody got the message. Let's go. Let's move. And he meant it. So the question says, do you find it uncharacteristic of Jesus, Son of Man, being the Son of God?
No, because God, every time I read this, I think about when God, same language, drove out man
Drove Adam out.
from the garden, right? And Jesus learned how to drive out man from God, right? He saw God do that. And the thing about human beings that we don't really recognize about Jesus is that he was present for all of our happenings, right? So Jesus witnessed the way that God had to aggressively manage mankind, because if it weren't for the dramatic nature of God, we would do what it is that we would do, whatever that would be. So God, whether it's fire and brimstone from heaven, whether it's, if you think about a cherubim and it says a flaming sword on every side, like people could say that's violent, because we never even saw the word sword before that during creation, right? Mm-hmm. So God had to bring something that was obviously familiar in heaven into the realm of earth and have a flame circling to ensure that mankind did not go back to a place that he didn't want them to be, not that man didn't want to be there. So I think it's very much in Jesus's characteristic. This is someone who's going to look at Peter, his beloved, and say, Satan, get behind me. I think that's the aspect of Jesus we don't like to admit existed, because it wasn't always docile or it doesn't fit into our understanding of meekness. But Jesus sometimes had a sharpness to him, you know, and you know how mad you have to be to get a whip and start beating, like just swatting at air. Even you have to be really mad to do that. So it's that same element I think that God possessed when he said, I'm going to cause a flood, because he was done. Jesus was done at that point. There was nothing that could take it back.
Interesting point you made about Adam's exit as God as father. God told Adam, and y'all all know the story. God told Adam, the day that you eat of this fruit, what will happen?
He would surely die.
Why? What was the stipulation behind you'll surely die? Because it was more to it than God just saying you'll surely die.
You would know.
Out of the garden.
You would know good.
When he drove him out, what was he saying driving Adam out? That Adam would
You
what?
said-
I have to do what to keep
Separate.
Adam from what?
Oh, eating of the fruit again
And live in what?
forever.
In what?
Sins.
In sin. Remember, Adam and Eve is made out of God's image. Okay? In saying that, Adam had the ability to come back or not leave. But God said because of what he did, he would live forever in rebellion to me, which was proven through the seed, correct? Every seed that is born has a rebellion nature to it because of the nature of Adam and Eve, right? The flood proved mankind's rebellion against God. Man just didn't listen. So God said, tired. I'm tired. God has displayed his frustration with humanity from the day he made us. He has displayed that. Now, it's just that on the Son of Man side, we want to keep Jesus back. We want to keep him over here. People don't preach and don't talk about the Son of God throwing people out of the house, because that's not the nature of Jesus. We don't want it to be known that the church is going to excommunicate us. They're going to disfellowship us for our sins and our foolishness. That's hard. God don't do things like that. You didn't read the Bible, right? You didn't read all them things that was going on in the Old Testament that made us as humanity push God to that limit. Ellis?
A couple of things. So, first of all, we don't know Jesus' characters. That's what's wrong with the world. You don't know anything about Jesus except what's written. You don't even know anything about Jesus' childhood. That's why the book we're reading makes sense. The world makes you think you know so much about Jesus. Jesus is God. God says, your ways and your thoughts are not mine. All you know about God is enough to get you to heaven. You don't know anything about God beforehand. You don't know what God does outside of time. Think about that. There's so much unknown that how dare you come to church or a Bible study thinking you know who Jesus is? His own disciples didn't know who he was. Remember the Last Supper, they said, tell us plainly. What was his response? Haven't I been with you all this time? So when somebody is trying to say, oh, this is Jesus' characteristics, like God, look at vengeance, right? And this is the other thing. I look at this scripture the same as I look at when people try to make a big deal about Jesus telling the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. Don't ever try to think you can do what Jesus does just because we're supposed to live like him, right? You're supposed to live in like him inside of your human frailties, right? God say vengeance is whose? His, but that means he don't want you to be vengeful. But he said, is he vengeful? God said he don't want you to be jealous, but what does he say about himself? He says, I'm a what kind of God? See, like we always want to be like, oh, there's certain things that God does that you can't do. Just like as a parent, there's certain things a parent does a child cannot do. Parents do well if they parent that way. Once you start associating your child as your best friend and y'all are equal, the kid will see you as equal, and equals get to do equal stuff. right? That's the whole point.
Jesus said, I'm Lord of the Sabbath.
Right. So when we
Sabbath is not
look
lazy.
at this, yeah, like there's things that God will do. This is why the parable of the wheat and the tares is so important. The people, the workers, us, they wanted to pull up, which is makes sense, right? Like, hey, I don't know who planted it while we were asleep, but now it's good green and bad green. But what was the response? You can't pull it up because you're gonna pull up everything. The harvest, I will decide at the end. That's God's point. You pray for people, love them. Keep praying for them. When they leave here, pray for them. I decide where they go. No one in here can decide, not even for your own children, what will happen to them when they die. Only God can. That's why when people pass, I say what? God have mercy on their soul. That's why in Bible study, when people try to bait me to say, well, are you saying my loved one is in heaven or hell? I'm not saying nothing. God decides where loved ones go. I'm just telling you, while you on this side of life, you need to do the things that God told you as a human being to do. God spoke to the thief on the cross. That have nothing to do with humans today. What does that have to do from your pastor yourself when Jesus said where someone is going? You have no say. You cannot say, well, Jesus is driving people out. That means I can be angry. Men use this. Men will be like, oh, because God is violent in the Old Testament, I can be violent. Wrong. Jesus showed you how you should be as a man, that you should love your wife and die for her. So when you look at these things, humanity love picking out the things that they want to be like God in terms of violence, but don't want to pick out when Jesus said, if somebody hit you on your cheek, you turn your other cheek. He told you that. See what I'm trying to say? Like when someone asks you for your cloak, you should give it to them. Now, I didn't say nothing about me because no one comes into heaven demanding things of me, but these are rules that y'all have to live by. I'm separate from you. That's why Jesus went and the angel said, you never gonna see him like that, because that was just a snapshot. That's not even Jesus. Isn't that what Paul is saying? The way that you knew Jesus physically was only to serve a purpose. Jesus always existed. No one created him. He is God. No one's mind can fathom that. That's why the point was the angel said, y'all have to go on with your life. The way you knew Jesus is gone, and that way is never coming back. When Jesus returns, he won't even return in the manner in which you, if you still live, remember. That's the whole point to the Thessalonians. Y'all have to go live your life. See, people in the first century had a struggle because they seen. Therefore, they assumed because they seen him, they knew everything about him. Like if somebody was going to take you in the Garden of Gethsemane, I assume you want me to chop their ear off. I assume you were going to come on a white horse and overthrow the Roman government. All these assumptions people had. Just like in the Old Testament, people assume that God was in this, God was in that, God is doing this. People today, the same thing. Assume that this person came in your life at the right time and God sent them. Who said that? We always look to everywhere except for the Bible to bake this assurity. There's plenty of things that you don't know. And I think as Christians, sometimes we struggle with that. That's why in Bible study, I tell people that there are no assurities outside of what's written here. People try to get me to give them an assurity. From where? I don't know everything about God's divine nature. If anybody say they do, they're lying, because how you know? All you know is from what's written. John is going to say in some chapters, Jesus did so many things, we couldn't even write them down. All I can write down to you was a couple chapters to get you to know that he was the Word. I couldn't tell you every characteristic about him because he's divinity, and therefore there's aspects of God's divinity that we're not privy to as children. That's the main thing that this passage, we got to understand is it's okay as a Christian to say there are things about God that God do that I can't do. Number one. There's things about God that God knows that I don't know. Number two, that's faith. There are things about Bible study and Christianity that fall under the faith category. This passage is one of them. This don't give nobody no right to act any kind of violence toward anything in terms of this, or to say, well, people would be like, well, you know, if this happened and this thing happened or this. God told you plenty in his New Testament how me and you should act in different situations. He is acting in a way to show people, I have the authority to act like this. I get to do this because this is my Father's house. This is not anyone else's Father's house but mine. I was before Abraham. Before Abraham, I am. That's why certain things, even his apostles, his disciples couldn't do, because he didn't give them the power, authority yet to do those things.
Jesus told, the psalmist say that God said that if I wanted something, I wouldn't ask you for it, right? In God's divine nature and who he is, the Old Testament, in Jesus's life, the Old Testament is full of God getting irritated with us. Israel is a perfect example of that. We have a lot of proof of the nature of God. Push his button. Push his button. There are times when we have to reveal that side of God. Like, God does get tired of us irritating him. And he reacts, and to the point that Ellis is making, it's not boundaries that he set on himself. It's not. Who locked the door? Think about it, brothers and sisters. It was going to be a flood that everybody laughed about. When stuff started floating by, it got serious. When that water got waist deep and children start grasping the air and there's nothing else to hold on to, because the water is now doing what it did in New Orleans with Katrina. The water is now riding up above trees. It's a flood now. Not everybody thought that was funny. But when the people who didn't drown got to the boat, who locked the door? God did. Because no one would have opened the door. Humanity was suffering outside. I would have opened the door. Think about it. God had passed judgment on humanity before the water hit the ground. The water was just validating God's word that had already went out. And God is not restricted that way. He's not. Because he's God. Now, that's the beautiful part of God. It is. You have to look at it that way. God's divine nature balances out his praise and grace and his lack of satisfaction with our behavior. And he has every right to do what he wants to do to us, and he's going to do that on Judgment Day. He has done it in the past when he's tired of our foolishness. Don't you get tired of your kids acting up? Yeah. Why can't God have that nature? You do get tired, and then what? You tap them on their butt. You tell them to go sit down. Think about that. This is a wonderful story. This is a wonderful time, Nadine.
And in the same way that when we discipline our kids, a tap on the butt or a slap somewhere else, to discipline them, it's not considered condoning violence. In the same way when Jesus did this, I mean, the next question, part of the question was, does it suggest that Jesus condoned violence? It's not condoning violence, right? And I think that in later in John, in chapter 8, when Jesus was also into the treasury of the temple teaching them, he mentioned to them, hey, if you knew God, you'd have known me, or if you know me, you'd have known God. And later on he says, there's nothing that I do that I don't do without his blessings, basically. He said in verse 29 of chapter 8, and he who sent me is with me, and the Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please him. So he said always there, so there's no case, I think, of condoning of violence, or even if the whip, I don't even think the whip hit the people there. Because I think if he had hit them with the whip, there would have been a riot, there would have been something there. I think it's because even in this section in chapter 8, they were ready to fight him, and he hadn't even taken up a whip, So I don't think he hit them with a whip, but I don't think we can consider this condoning of violence, even if he had hit them, because he's always true and he's always faithful and he's always just.
I just want to make it clear that while he's under the Son of Man thing, remember, Jesus just showing us the very nature of God. That's all he's doing. But for you and me as humanity to put restrictions on God and how God do things, come on, let's stop that. Let's stop that. Let's just do one thing. Deuteronomy 29:29 says what? Somebody read it. Deuteronomy 29:29 says what?
The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law.
Here it is. Take advantage of it while you're a human being. Because anything outside of what is printed for you and me, it ain't even in our thought process. Because God is God way before we even thought. There's no beginning to God. So God is God way before we even thought about being created. And he's going to be God way after Judgment Day. You know what I'm saying? So let God be God. And don't restrict God. Don't start trying to make God bad in the things that God do when it's time for God to discipline. Because they don't go there. Don't go there. Did we get the book circulated?
No.
Don't go there, Erica.
And one thing that is different for us as we worship than I think with the Israelites or Jewish people is that their race and their religion and their politics were one thing. For us, because we have a separation of church and state, it's sometimes difficult for us to understand even this idea of the law, right? Because our law is so much different than our spiritual law, which is why I think Christianity in America is complicated, because we can be alleviated or we can be allowed to do things in a physical law that really we can't do in a spiritual law, right? There's no physical law that says you can't, what's something? Huh? Eat certain, yeah, but then like spiritually, there may be different types of restrictions. So part of Jesus clearing out the temple, it was spiritual, right? Because the temple was a place of worship.
Right.
Jesus also was not in, and we see this playing out in the rest of the book of John, and he was not in any way condoning the level of classism and racism and sexism that had become a part of their religious and worshiping practices. Correct. So I think it's multifaceted because Jesus is saying, we're not doing this here. But part of what Dev and Nadine were describing in terms of like the exchange of money, there was also this exchange of ideology that was not spiritual, that God was absolutely not willing to tolerate anymore. So when we see Jesus at a well with a Gentile woman, it's the same person. It's the same. We separate these instances of Jesus's life, forgetting that like he truly was the expression of God. So if God was willing to go out of his way to talk to a woman who was quote unquote unclean, it's the same God that was whipping in that moment. Right. So I feel like when I read these things, I try to think about obviously like the religious aspect, but Jesus was for everybody. And what they were doing in that temple was so rooted and grounded in classism and also oppression. Like the Pharisees were oppressing their own people, which is why Jesus, I don't think, could have been born into royalty, right? Like he took on the common person because his family was a part of that. Like, how did they end up? What did his parents offer if they had to offer something? 2 pigeons. Okay, so they weren't like a bunch of wealthy people. So I think there was also that element of classism in the midst of like the politics that Jesus was overthrowing while he was doing this.
All right, in closing, it says, do you think some people respected Jesus all the more because he tried to stop the desecration of the temple? Do you suppose many people in Jerusalem were talking about what he did? David.
I don't think they really understood.
Confused.
This was the house of the Lord. The presence of God was in that temple. And Jesus, out of zeal, remember Psalm 69, zeal for my Father's house. He, this was where God lived, his presence. Part of it is, you can look at that computer and say, there's not so much information, it's not gonna burn my eyes out. But in the temple, God is there. Moses couldn't go by and look at God, but in the temple, you can't go in there and see the presence of the God. It'll burn you up in the bits of information that you'll never come back from. Jesus knew God, and out of zeal for love for him, to see what was going on. His temple was to be a house of prayer. There was no prayer going on at all there.
And remember, he's seen this from where? Before he became this, he's seen that. Remember, y'all, God was silent for 400 years. What do you think Jesus was? Hidden in Mary's womb? Quiet? Until he was energized to come as a baby? He was where he was before. In glory. He's seen all this nonsense going on. So how do you think he's going to act when he get down here physically? I think sometimes we just rob these stories of their essence. We so smart now as Bible students, and we've been with God now and seen all the things that he's done in our lives, that we forget Sarah laughed when the angels were talking to her husband and said she was going to have a child. See how insignificant these things are to human beings? They would say, what you laughing at? Nothing. You gotta be kidding me. But is there anything impossible with God? No. No. So think about it. Here's who he is. And we love him on his terms. And by no means do we equate him with what we do, how we think, and the things that because there's no comparison. And whatever God do, I tell folks all the time when I'm talking with them, studying, well, whatever God does is fair, so you can stop that right now. I get so sick and tired of people saying to me, if God was such a loving God, why does this happen? And why do he allow this happen? Why don't you stop doing what you do? That's what I tell them, if you stop doing what you were doing, you won't have to worry about the amount of things that God should be responsible for, because you'll be one less person he gotta look over every single day. You stop doing what you do. That's all. As simple as that. Okay, we have a prayer book.
Yeah, I'm sending you up a little.
Oh, okay.
Here it is.
You don't have the name last time? For the day, come on.